This story begins in 1938 in undivided India, the year of King George VI, Emperor of the United Kingdom and the dominions of the Commonwealth. On April 15th of that year, C.P. Kukreja is born in Gajani, present-day Pakistan. The story of his life would become interwoven with the story of India's architectural transformation. A year later, on 1st September 1939, the great European theatre of war will open curtains in Poland. By the third day, United Kingdom and all of its dominions will be engaged in total war against Germany, marking the beginning of the end of the British Raj in India. The 1940s was a decade of agony and restlessness for the country. As the Second World War bled dry British banks, resistance to colonial rule escalated. The Quit India movement of 1942 united millions in their demand for liberty. Political unrest manifested in widespread riots, while famine and economic downfall further eroded the bastions of the colony. Amid this turmoil, the subcontinent was hastily divided into India and Pakistan, a partition that gutted the gold mine of a great unity, reconciled over a millennium. It displaced millions and altered the entire course of history. With the partition dust still settling, faint murmurs of a young India swelled into a vociferous and resolute call. A young C.P. Kukreja grew up witnessing firsthand the birth of a nation.
Large parts of India during this period saw colonial structures that stood as symbols of past powers, but not really of belonging. The architecture of this time, dominated by company style, stood as grand monuments of imperialism, mammoth in scale, but perhaps a bit hollow in spirit. During the partition, suddenly cities like Delhi and Kolkata saw masses seeking housing and infrastructure. Modernist architecture in the early years of the Republic became a tool for survival and repair, a practical response to the spoils of the partition. Jawaharlal Nehru, independent India's first Prime Minister, believed architecture could shape society. He invited international modernists like Le Corbusier, who designed Chandigarh, India's first planned modern city. While Indian architects like Achyut Kanvinde and Habib Rahman brought ideas of simplicity and utility from the West and adapted them to the Indian context. This was modernism's genesis in the subcontinent.
The 1960s were an exciting time. Youth movements erupted all over the world, a movement that engendered hitherto classist or ageist dominions of architecture and culture. The most documented, perhaps, was the civil rights movement of the United States, which in turn was inspired by the Satyagraha movement of India's independence. Between 1960 and 1967, a young C.P. Kukreja received an education in architecture, first in India, then across the world in Australia and Canada. He worked with the Public Works Department of Victoria and witnessed at the epicenter in London the evolution of modernism.
But his inner compass kept pointing eastwards. His desire and longing to come back to India, apply his skills and knowledge from whatever he had learned with experiences and studies and education and work across the world, he wanted to come back and utilize it in India. And that was the idea where he came back in 1966, started working initially with Achyut Kanvinde, and very soon started his own small design studio.
During this time, Delhi's architectural landscape was being sculpted by the American-Indian architect Joseph Allen Stein. With his design of the India International Center in 1962, he had introduced the idea of a climate-responsive modernism, a design that was both functional and rooted in the evolving identity of India. In 1969, a national competition was announced for the design of the ambitious Jawaharlal Nehru University, envisioned as a modern institution that embodied Nehru's ideals of tolerance, reason, and the pursuit of truth. Situated over 1,000 acres of undulating terrain near Munirka village in South Delhi, the site was characterized by its striking topography, rocky outcrops, monsoon channels, and ravines, elements that were to be integrated into the campus design. On September 2nd, 1970, C.P. Kukreja, then a 32-year-old architect, won the commission among 68 international entries. He imagined a deer park, a sanctuary, an architectural vocabulary which eschewed colonial symbols and embraced the site's naturally occurring contortions. Within Aravali's unique topography, his red brick face edifices appear as though they gradually evolved from the earth.
I consider the decade of 1970s as a period of awakening, politically and culturally. In the West, we see this movement where the space research had reached almost a crescendo. In our very own India, we see the establishment of Indian Space Research Organization, the Pokhran nuclear tests that take place, the Rajdhani Express trains were introduced, and banks were nationalized. So a period where a lot was churning even within our country. We also see that there are movements happening here towards establishing the idea of a new India, a nationalized movement. On the darker side, there was the Third Indo-Pakistan War, which was being fought on our borders. We had a period of the dark side of emergency in the mid-1970s. And also, there was inflation at an all-time high. For C.P. Kukreja, the Jawaharlal Nehru University was an opportunity to create another kind of living environment, a community which would actually reflect India's quest for intellectual freedom, the idea of living close to nature, belonging to nature at a time which was otherwise turbulent with what was going around. Looking back, I realized that it was a profound desire of my father to share his learnings and knowledge with public. His research on how to build in the tropics led to a document, a book which was authored by him in 1978 called Tropical Architecture. And this was perhaps the first time there was something where a document, a research had been conducted on how to build in the indigenized conditions rather than importing Western knowledge and literature and then trying to build with our own vernacular materials. So this was something which was a very important movement and has gone on to be an idea which was later also adapted, I would say, in popular notion in terms of sustainability. And even today, the world half a century later is awakening to the ideas of climate change and sustainable design. But back then in 1978, Kukreja had authored this book, Tropical Architecture.
The 1980s marked a renaissance in India's architecture as the country began to reassess its identity in the wake of post-independence modernism. Global influence receded and an emphasis on regional traditions grew. The nation embraced its pluralistic ethos. Architects across India sought to reinterpret local conditions against the homogenizing force of globalization, a pursuit evident in the works of Anant Raje and B.V. Doshi. Raje believed architecture should reveal a natural order, shaping spaces through geometry, light, and shadow, as seen in his Indian Institute of Forest Management, Bhopal. Minimal in material use, the building was intended to evolve over time, much like ruins, allowing it to age with its natural setting. Meanwhile, in Indore, Doshi explored architecture's role in fostering belonging, particularly for marginalized communities. His Aranya low-cost housing redefined low-cost housing as a self-sustaining, participatory network of streets, courtyards, and homes that empowered residents to shape their own environment, challenging the notion that affordability necessitated uniformity. Doshi's vision had transformed mass housing into a self-determined, vibrant, dignified, and socially responsive community.
This ethos of Indian culture and spiritualism can be found in a great example in how India opened its arms to Tibet and the Tibetans who came into this country, their desire, their longing, their aspirations for having their own environment, which led to the project, the Karmapa International Buddhist Institute, right here in the heart of South Delhi. Now, to create an environment in this urban chaotic conditions of the city, how this project literally looks inwards, creating a very meditative context and an environment where you have fostering Buddhist learning. And that was created here in an architecture which was also driven and inspired by the Rumtek monastery from Sikkim. You had large number of craftsmen who were brought in here, bringing those architectural styles and craftsmanship. But while it was back in Sikkim, created in timber, the same kind of construction in Delhi had to happen in brick and concrete. So how that metamorphosis takes place, and yet the drive towards sustainability, using natural dyes and pigments rather than artificial paints. This whole emphasis on sustainability, tranquility, spirituality, and celebration of cultures can be found in no better example than the Karmapa Institute.
The Soviet Union had been a strong supporter of India since independence. They helped strengthen our economy and to a large extent influenced our policy frameworks. They built Bhilai and Bokaro steel plants, gave us the MiG-21, our first nuclear submarine, INS Chakra. They even preferred us to the Chinese to a point that it scarred their relations with each other. But by the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, official attitudes had changed. On July 24, 1991, India opened its economy to the world, igniting an economic revolution, spurring modernization and urban expansion. Cities, once symbols of colonial planning, began evolving into hubs of global connectivity. The architecture mirrored this transition.
India had opened its doors to the world. The architectural world was abuzz with excitement. New materials, new technologies, everything that you could think of and had seen around the world was today available in India. And in this kind of a scenario, it was even more important that were we going to be able to retain our own Indian identity. I remember seeing this building in Connaught Place, which was designed by Mr. 𝐵𝐼𝐻 in a very bold, brutalist architectural style, which was suddenly enveloped with a curtain glazing. Now, in this phenomena, you see the emergence of Ambadi, which was designed by Mr. Kukreja. A building which was not only searching, but really celebrating an Indian identity. Whether it is the arabesque mosaic tiles, whether it is the decorated intricate jalis, or it is about the glass elevators, it was a fusion of tradition with modernity. It was about creating a blank canvas adorned with art. So for the first time ever, a building which would be a tall skyscraper in Delhi had a skyline which was seen from far away. It was actually a work of art. So this blend of art and architecture was something which was in the midst of what was otherwise a phenomena of global architecture coming and pervading all over India.
During this time, architects like Raj Rewal too left their mark in the city's skyline. His work on Scope Complex celebrated bold geometries and the fortress-like planning, which he marks as being derived from the historical Tatiya Palace in Madhya Pradesh. This period was as much about preserving identity as it was about embracing change. We saw cities reaching upward and outward, and the architecture epitomized this growth, informed, of course, by a sense of cultural responsibility. The year 2000 brought the Y2K crisis and with it an inflection point for India's economy. The liberalization of the past decade had begun to bear fruit in the shape of India's IT and communications revolution, catapulting the nation into the global arena. This surge in India's IT sector, fueled by a strong education system, led by institutions like the IITs and steered by companies like Tata Consultancy Service, Wipro and HCL, brought a significant influx of professionals to cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad, which became IT capitals. A new form of networked urbanism mirrored in glass-clad corporate towers started coming up. Architects rose to the challenge, designing large-capacity housing units and employing innovative construction methods. Open space planning and vertical expansion became defining features, with buildings rising up quicker than ever before, with novel construction technologies like Maivan formwork. Cranes dotted the skylines of major cities during this period. Architects like Sanjay Puri were redefining corporate architecture by introducing bold, futuristic designs, exemplified by projects like the Infosys Software Development Building in Mysore. Within a single decade, this revolution had dramatically altered the dynamics of Indian cities as we knew them.
In this period came the opportunity to create Pathways World School, India's first platinum-rated school project. And the way the site was located on the Aravalli Hills, a very rocky terrain, having lots of slopes and topography, and in this to be able to create buildings which were not just about education, but I would call them learning. An opportunity where students, faculty coexist in an environment where you're able to enjoy nature. To do that, the celebration was by actually creating a lake in the heart of the complex. Not just for aesthetic reasons, but very importantly to celebrate the biodiversity of that area and create a water resource, given the site was so remotely located that in case of any emergency, you would need water to douse any fire or any such emergency which would take place. The lake itself has been with the participation of the local community, the artisans from there who created the patterns which become the body of the lake itself. Similarly, having a lot of local landscape which becomes part of the project, rather than having mega buildings being imposed on this very fragile, eco-friendly site, it was about small building footprints which come together and are circled around the lake literally like a necklace. That's what Pathways School has been about and has been celebrated not so much just for its academic learning as much also for its physical environment.
With the arrival of the 2010s, we witnessed India nearing a degree of self-actualization. Government recognized the urgency to address the demands of rapid urbanization. Building large-scale infrastructure was now made possible not merely as utilities but as instruments of national growth. Metro projects, long envisioned since the 1990s, finally began materializing across cities, changing the way we moved entire populations. Energy demands evolved, with cleaner fuels like CNG and eco-diesel revolutionizing urban transportation. The idea of renewable energy came to the fore. Political paradigm shifted, enabling ambitious projects like the Gujarat International Finance Tech City or GIFT City to be commissioned. Despite the absence of established building codes for such iconic mega projects, the industry adapted swiftly, and by the mid-decade, regulatory frameworks were in place aligning these aspirations with global standards. Amid the rapid pace of growth and the westernized buildings that had emerged during the IT revolution, a renewed sense of cultural identity began to take shape. Architects grounded contemporary designs in India's traditions and history. The Sabarmati riverfront, reimagined by Hasmukh C. Patel architects, stands as a defining example, a project that revitalized Ahmedabad's lifeline and turned it into a dynamic urban space. More than a feat of urban planning, it symbolizes how rivers, integral to India's cultural fabric, can inspire sustainable transformations that resonate far beyond their immediate surroundings.
The decade starting 2010s laid the foundation for a new India. An India that was recognizant of its glorious past while charting a future-oriented path. As the nation forged significant alliances and signed some of the largest business deals in the world, there came the need for spaces capable of hosting prestigious events such as the G20 summit and other global delegations. Architecture has always mirrored this evolution, becoming a symbol for the nation's rising global recognition as a soft power. Yashobhoomi, India's International Convention and Expo Center, embodies the ambitions of a nation that is both reaching out to the world and welcoming it in return. It wasn't about creating a world-class venue, it was about celebrating India's architectural heritage. The intricate jalis, expansive halls, and cultural motifs stand as tributes to tradition, fused with innovation to reflect the evolving identity of a global yet deeply rooted India.
The 2020s began with an unprecedented global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. Cities around the world came to a standstill as lockdowns and social distancing redefined urban life. The pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities in our urban planning and the critical role of architecture in supporting resilience, health, and well-being. The isolation brought on by the pandemic took a toll on mental health, with urban dwellers feeling the strain of confined spaces and lack of social interaction. Compact apartments and congested neighborhoods magnified the need for better access to open spaces, natural light, and ventilation. During this time, architects like architecture discipline looked at the future urbanism as a resilience building exercise rather than an economic criterion. One can see it in projects like the post-pandemic Homes of the Future or the Life CMF Healthcare Center, where discarded industrial waste like shipping containers are put together to form a comprehensive Medicare unit.
The pandemic brought senseless loss and forced us into deep introspection. It showed us the need for spaces that are more than functional, but instead ones that heal, connect, and inspire, creating environments that nurture the human spirit. It showed us that we must prioritize open spaces, green infrastructure, and circularity. The pandemic underscored the urgency for rethinking cities not just as places to live, but as sanctuaries for health and well-being. Architects like Anupama Kundu and Vinu Daniel, they have a lot to show us in this regard. Their works have a deep embodiment with nature. The use of materials like mud, bamboo, and reclaimed waste actually blur the boundaries between the built environment and nature. Their designs evoke a sense of life coming full circle. We emerged from nature, and now, in our search for balance, we are slowly but steadily finding our way back to it. Architecture, I believe, is the story of humanity's enduring quest to define its place in the universe. Over time, our spaces become the stories we leave behind. As we look to the future, we carry the responsibility of designing spaces that echo the dreams of generations, spaces that honor our past, engage deeply with our present, and meaningfully define our futures.